They were gods behind gold-tinted glass, faces immortalized in flickering frames, voices carried across oceans by radio waves, eyes magnified 100 times larger than life by the cathedral walls of a cinema. But when the credits finally rolled, when the crowds dispersed and the stars stopped shining, what remained? For some, it was chaos. For others, cold control. But for a rare few, it was something stranger, something inexplicable. One left a fortune to a dog, demanding that its pedigree be protected like a crown jewel. Another wrote a name, one no one had ever heard of, on a crumpled page, a will found in the glove box of a car abandoned in the desert. And one, Hollywood's most luminous flame, handed over her legacy to the very doctor who had locked her behind padded walls. These weren't just final acts. They were declarations, confessions, sometimes revenge, often riddles. This is not a story about money. It's a story about meaning, the kind of meaning people fight over, mourn for, and sometimes die chasing. In the golden age of Hollywood, the end of a life was just the beginning of the strangest story yet. When the cameras stopped rolling, the real scripts began, signed, notarized, and hidden in vaults, safes, and dusty drawers. And what they reveal might just rewrite everything we thought we knew about our favorite stars. So sit back. The lights are dimming. Let's unseal the most bizarre, most haunting, and most heartbreakingly human secrets buried inside the wills of Golden Age Hollywood's brightest and most troubled icons. What they left behind was anything but ordinary. Chapter 1. A snapshot of the era. Long before TMZ headlines and Instagram posthumous tributes, Hollywood death was a spectacle of a different kind. In the Golden Age, from the 1920s through the 1960s, the movie studios ran their stars' lives with an iron grip. Diets were dictated, dates were staged, scandals buried, but there was one thing even the studios couldn't control: what their stars did with their estates when they died. The last will and testament, a simple legal document for most people, became a final performance in the court of public opinion for the stars. Fan magazines pounced on the smallest details. Lines from wills were reprinted in newspapers like cryptic final messages from gods descending Mount Olympus. Who got what? Who was cut out? And, most tantalizing of all, why? In an era where privacy was an illusion, these final testaments were often the only unscripted thing a star would ever release to the world. And with each bizarre bequest or stunning omission, a portrait emerged. Not of the starlet or leading man from the screen, but of the lonely soul who died behind closed doors. Studios tried to keep these revelations quiet. Lawyers fought to redact details. But death, it turns out, was one contract no publicist could renegotiate. And in the shuffle of safe deposit keys and estate inventories, the weirdness leaked out, piece by piece. What followed were battles, not just for money, but for narrative, for legacy. In a town built on illusion, wills revealed the raw truth, or at least the version the deceased was willing to commit to paper, sometimes sentimental, sometimes vengeful, sometimes outright deranged. And it all began with names. Names in ink. Names that echoed louder in death than they ever did in life. Let's start with a man whose final will became a global mystery. A billionaire recluse, a genius inventor, and a Hollywood playboy who vanished behind locked hotel doors and emerged only to ignite a legal firestorm. Chapter 2. Howard Hughes and the Phantom Will. When Howard Hughes died in 1976, he left behind more than an aviation empire, more than failed film reels, more than the hushed whispers of countless lovers and a fortune surpassing $2 billion. He left behind a mystery, and not just any mystery, a handwritten will, allegedly penned by the ghost of Hughes himself, naming a total stranger as a major heir. Enter Melvin Dummer, a gas station worker from Utah. Dummer claimed that years earlier, he had rescued a ragged, disoriented man from the side of a desert highway. The man said he was Howard Hughes. Dummer didn't believe him, but gave him a ride to the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas anyway. And that would have been that, until after Hughes' death, a so-called Mormon will surfaced at the headquarters of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It was unsigned, slightly sloppy, but it included Melvin Dummer's name. It awarded him $156 million. Also included in the will were strange details, oddly specific bequests to people long since estranged from Hughes, misspellings, a layout that suggested either hurried handwriting or a deliberate attempt to mimic Hughes's notoriously erratic penmanship. Some thought it was authentic. Others were convinced it was a hoax. The estate, without a legally recognized will, was soon a feeding frenzy. More than 20 claimants surfaced across the country, all alleging to be heirs. One woman claimed to be his daughter. A man said he was Hughes' long-lost brother. The courts, already buried in paperwork, were forced to reckon with a question that still haunts legal scholars to this day. What does truth look like when a billionaire never trusted anyone enough to write it down? Eventually, after a trial and massive media coverage, the Mormon will was declared a forgery. Melvin Dummer was cut out. The official line was that Hughes died intestate, without a will at all. His fortune was distributed among 22 distant cousins, and his legacy faded behind conspiracy theories and locked vaults. But the question lingered. What kind of man, worth more than a small nation? Why would Hughes, obsessive to the point of madness, allow his empire to vanish into courtrooms and chaos? Some say he didn't. Some believe the will was real, and that Hughes' final act was to thank a stranger, the only person who had shown him kindness with no agenda. But in a world ruled by lawyers, kindness isn't currency. The ink dried, the courts ruled, and Hughes' legend only grew, not because of what he built in life, but because of what he failed to secure in death. Up next, a starlet who captivated the world, yet left the bulk of her estate to the man who claimed to teach her how to feel. Let's turn the page to Chapter 3, Marilyn Monroe and the Haunted Inheritance. Marilyn Monroe. The name itself still glows like a neon marquee. The walk, the whisper, the loneliness. By the time she died in 1962, just 36 years old, Marilyn had become more myth than woman. But in her will, buried beneath the legend, lay a heartbreaking glimpse of the real Norma Jean. Unlike Howard Hughes, Monroe had a will. It was signed in January 1961, just over a year before her death. And its contents weren't just unexpected, they were hauntingly revealing. First, she left a modest sum, $10,000, to her longtime secretary and friend, May Rice. Then, a portion of her personal effects and $100,000 went to her half-sister, Bernice Miracle, and her mother, Gladys, who had long struggled with mental illness. But the vast majority of Marilyn's estate, 75%, was entrusted to one man, Lee Strasberg. Strasberg wasn't a relative. He wasn't her lover. He was her mentor, her acting coach, the quiet, intense man who taught her the method, the emotional excavation that helped transform her from a pretty face into a force of vulnerability and presence on screen. He was also the man who, decades after her death, kept her estate under lock and key, refusing to share her private writings, letters, and effects with the world, even as her legend ballooned. To Marilyn, Lee had been salvation, a tether in the storm. She once called him the only father I've ever known, but some questioned whether Strasberg had been protector or gatekeeper. Even stranger, another chunk of her estate, 25%, was left to Dr. Marianne Criss, her psychiatrist. The same woman who, at one of Monroe's lowest moments, had her committed to the Payne Whitney Psychiatric Clinic in New York. It was a decision Marilyn would call a betrayal. Her letters from inside the clinic are frantic and harrowing. "There was no empathy at Payne Whitney," she wrote. "It had a very bad effect. They asked me after putting me in a cell, I mean cement blocks and all, for very disturbed, depressed patients, for me to come out of it singing Christmas carols." Yet she still left Dr. Criss a quarter of her estate, with instructions to use it for psychiatric work. Why? Some say guilt. Others say forgiveness. Or perhaps it was the ultimate act of desperation, wanting her pain to mean something, wanting someone to understand it, finally. But the aftermath of her death was anything but healing. Strasberg's widow, Anna, would later inherit control of Marilyn's estate, turning her image into a multi-million-dollar industry. Perfumes, billboards, licensing deals. Marilyn's face became a brand, a ghost sold to the highest bidder. She had once said, "I don't want to be rich. I just want to be wonderful." In death, she became both, but not in the way she ever intended. And what she left behind, those oddly chosen heirs, that eerie loyalty to the very people who had institutionalized or monetized her, became the most poignant mystery of all. Next, a screen legend known for her sharp cheekbones and even sharper tongue. A mother who left behind not just an estate, but an open wound. Chapter 4. Joan Crawford and the Cold Cut. She was Hollywood's reigning queen of discipline. Eyebrows arched like daggers, shoulders back, chin high, voice as crisp as the crystal in her decanters. Joan Crawford didn't walk into rooms, she took possession of them. She built her career through sheer force of will, transforming herself from Lucille Fay LeSueur, a scrappy girl from San Antonio, into a shimmering symbol of studio perfection. But behind the scenes, it was control. Control over image, control over emotions, and, as it turned out, control even from the grave. When Joan Crawford died in 1977, her will made headlines across the country, not for what it included, but for what it deliberately left out. "To my son, Christopher, and my daughter, Christina," the will read, "I leave nothing, for reasons which are well known to them." That single sentence, so sharp, so cold, ignited a media firestorm. At the time, Christina Crawford had already begun work on a tell-all memoir. A year later, she would publish Mommy Dearest, a book that would redefine Joan's legacy. Wire hangers, ice baths, beatings. It painted a portrait of Joan Crawford not as glamorous screen goddess, but as a violent, vain, and emotionally abusive tyrant. Whether you believed Christina or not, the will became a symbolic dagger. Joan, in death, seemed to confirm the bitterness. Of her adopted children, only Cindy and Kathy were remembered in the document, each receiving a modest trust of $77,500. The rest of her estate, valued at around $2 million, was divided among charities like the Motion Picture Home and the American Cancer Society. It was a tidy, deliberate will, crafted with the same precision that Joan had demanded in her home. Some called it justice, others cruelty. But one thing was certain: Joan's will was a final performance, and she made sure the applause went only to those she chose. Later, both disinherited children sued the estate. A quiet settlement granted them a reported $55,000 each. Not a fortune, but a tacit acknowledgement that perhaps not everything was as clear-cut as Joan had tried to make it seem. What the will didn't say, what it could never admit, was the aching complexity of a woman who had grown up poor, desperate, and convinced that love was something to be earned through perfection and obedience. Joan Crawford didn't believe in soft exits. Not in life, not in death, and her final legal words ensured that decades later, her story would be as contested as her legacy. Coming next, not a movie star but a real estate empress with a flair for cruelty and control, who left a fortune to a dog and strings so tight they nearly garroted her entire family. Chapter 5. Leona Helmsley and the $12 million dog. She wasn't a movie star, but Leona Helmsley lived like one. The billionaire hotel magnate, infamously dubbed the Queen of Mean, had a face lifted by plastic surgeons, a wardrobe suited for a Fifth Avenue fashion show, and a temper that could reduce grown men to silence. In life, she wielded her wealth like a weapon. In death, she turned it into a riddle. When Leona died in 2007, her will wasn't just extravagant, it was theatrical. An operatic blend of affection, pettiness, and paranoia, scrawled into the annals of inheritance law. But it was one clause that caught the world's attention. She left $12 million to her dog. Yes, a dog, a small white Maltese named Trouble, fluffy, pampered, and infamously aggressive. Trouble received more money than most people see in 10 lifetimes. She became the richest dog in the world overnight. And it didn't end there. Leona also disinherited 2 of her 4 grandchildren. Citing vague reasons known to them, she left millions to the other 2, but with an eerie condition. They had to visit their father's grave once a year or forfeit the money. This wasn't just a will, it was a series of demands. orders from beyond the grave, strings she intended to pull from the afterlife. But the courts had other ideas. A judge eventually reduced Trouble's inheritance from $12 million to $2 million, citing Helmsley's questionable mental state and the disproportionate nature of the bequest. The disinherited grandchildren, meanwhile, challenged the will and received undisclosed settlements. Trouble, mean little face and all, was moved to a secret location for her own safety. She had reportedly received kidnapping threats. Yes, the dog. And as for Leona, her estate, worth an estimated $5 billion, was mired in lawsuits and red tape for years. Some said she was trying to send a message. Others believed she was simply mad with power, using her final breaths to punish, reward, and choreograph her family's future like a cruel puppet master. But one thing was undeniable. She had turned her death into theater, and just like a closing curtain, the will fell with finality. It wasn't love she sought, it was control, and even the grave couldn't loosen her grip. With these strange and riveting cases behind us, Hughes' ghost signature, Marilyn's misplaced loyalties, Crawford's frozen heart, and Helmsley's diamond-studded leash, we now step back to see the pattern emerge. Let's explore what these wills reveal about the era and the people caught within its gilded cage. Chapter 6. What wills reveal about Golden Age souls. Taken individually, these wills are spectacles, oddities that spark headlines, court cases, and late-night gossip. But together they form a mosaic of the Golden Age psyche. Brilliant, broken, fiercely private, and desperately human. First, the most striking pattern, the presence of pets and strangers, and the absence of blood. In multiple cases, wealth wasn't left to family but to dogs, secretaries, psychiatrists, and mentors. Trust, in Hollywood, was rarely found at the dinner table. Instead, it was stitched into professional dependencies and transactional relationships, bonded not by blood, but by need. The people closest to the stars were often the ones paid to be there. Second, control beyond the grave. Leona Helmsley, Joan Crawford, even Marilyn Monroe. They didn't just leave money, they left instructions, conditions, unseen strings. Their wills were not acts of generosity, they were blueprints. Final performances with set direction and stage cues, whether it was forcing visits to a grave or silencing children with a disinheritance, these were women who refused to let go of the narrative, even in death. Third, the ghost of the studio system. Many of these figures were shaped, some say warped, by the machinery of Golden Age Hollywood. Marilyn wasn't just a woman, she was a manufactured product. Crawford wasn't allowed to age. She reinvented herself constantly to survive the system. Hughes, under the weight of expectation and paranoia, cracked from within. They were conditioned to present perfection outwardly and hide all else. So when they finally had control, when they were free from contracts, agents, gossip columnists, some didn't know how to express love or legacy in any healthy form. Their wills became therapy, punishment, apologies, cries for understanding. And finally, perhaps the most haunting theme of all, the desperation for immortality. In leaving fortunes to pets, or directing biographical rights to mentors, or ensuring their images stayed protected or monetized, they were all trying, in some form, to live on. The camera had stopped rolling, but they still wanted the spotlight, still wanted to control how the audience would remember them. Yet legacy, like love, is never guaranteed. A will can guide an estate, but it can't control the narrative. That belongs to history and to us. Now let's step back in time one last time, into the private moments that shaped these final acts. In the next section, we'll revisit the deeply emotional flashpoints, those small human moments that hint at why these stars wrote what they did. Chapter 7. The quiet moments behind the clauses. Howard Hughes, once a titan of invention and aviation, spent the final years of his life hidden behind blackout curtains in a penthouse suite in the Bahamas. His fingernails, grown grotesquely long, curled like talons. He refused to bathe. He spoke to almost no one directly. And yet, perhaps driven by a final flicker of warmth, he scribbled a name. Melvin Dummer. Imagine him that day, paper trembling in one hand, thinking of the stranger who gave him a lift, the only man who didn't want something from him. Maybe Hughes wanted to reward that decency. Maybe he wanted to believe kindness still existed. Or maybe he was just playing his final game. Marilyn Monroe, trapped in the Payne Whitney Psychiatric Clinic, wrote desperate letters to anyone who might listen. "Please help me," she begged. "This is a mistake. I am not insane." And yet, a year later, in her will, she left 25% of her estate to the very doctor who had ordered the institutionalization. Was it forgiveness? Hope? Was she trying to make her pain mean something? Maybe it was the only way she could assign value to her suffering. Joan Crawford, years before her death, would stand at her window, drink in hand, surveying her immaculate living room, every pillow placed perfectly, every surface dusted. She had built a kingdom of order where she could be queen, and when her daughter Christina challenged that image, first in life, then in memoir, Joan struck back the only way she knew how, with silence. Legal, binding silence. Nothing, for reasons well known to them. And Leona Helmsley, that sharp-boned monarch of the Helmsley Palace Hotel, would reportedly spend hours barking orders at maids, chefs, and butlers. She once fired a housekeeper for missing a smudge on a mirror. In her mind, discipline was love. And so, when she left $12 million to Trouble, her Maltese, she wasn't just rewarding loyalty. She was reminding her human heirs that they'd never measured up. Each flashback, each memory, each private unraveling explains something the will alone cannot, because a will is not a soul. It's a mirror, and what these stars saw when they finally turned that mirror inward wasn't always pretty. It was often lonely. And yet in those glimpses, we find something more valuable than diamonds or dollars. We find the truth. Now let's head toward the final curtain, where the chaos of the courtroom meets the cold finality of the law. These strange wishes may have been written in ink, but they were interpreted in fire. Let's unravel how each estate ended, and how their final battles were won or lost. Chapter 8. The Last Battle for Legacy. Wills are words. Courts need proof, and in Hollywood, where illusion is a currency, proving truth can be harder than spinning a lie. Howard Hughes' estate ignited one of the most dramatic legal infernos in probate history. More than 600 potential heirs surfaced. People crawled out of woodwork with napkins, matchbooks, and crumpled scraps, claiming to be in possession of the true will. The so-called Mormon will, which named Melvin Dummer as a $156 million beneficiary, was dismissed as a forgery after a 2-year legal war. Dummer never saw a dime. Hughes' empire, airlines, casinos, real estate, was divided among 22 distant cousins, some of whom had never even met him. The man who once tried to buy silence from Congress couldn't even buy clarity in death. In the end, the courts had the final cut on his life story. Marilyn Monroe's will was legal, signed, and precise, but its emotional aftermath was anything but orderly. Lee Strasberg, the great acting guru, inherited her estate, but rather than act as custodian of her memory, he held her belongings in near total secrecy until his death. Then his widow, Anna Strasberg, a woman Marilyn had never met, took over the estate and began licensing her name and image around the globe. Perfume, wine, graphic tees. Marilyn, who longed for respect as a serious actress, became a posthumous brand, a logo printed on merchandise sold in airports and malls. Even more unsettling, her personal writings, diaries, poems, and letters were kept locked away for decades. In 2010, they were finally released in a book called Fragments, and readers finally saw the raw, wounded woman behind the myth. But it was too late. Her estate had already become a money machine. The control she sought in life over her voice, her image, her truth was sold again and again after death. Joan Crawford's estate was cleaner on paper, but the media frenzy that followed Mommy Dearest turned her legal choices into a public spectacle. The line in her will, for reasons well known to them, became legend, a catchphrase for emotional vengeance. Her disinherited children sued. Eventually, they settled quietly. Joan's estate choosing to buy peace rather than wage a long war. Still, the damage was done. No amount of trust funds or charitable donations could erase the shadow of the tell-all. In death, Joan lost control of her narrative. Her image, once sharp and commanding, was softened, parodied, then villainized. The final word wasn't written by her lawyer, it was written by her daughter. Leona Helmsley's court drama was operatic. The judge who presided over the dispute called her will irrational. The $12 million left to her dog Trouble was slashed to $2 million, citing Helmsley's declining mental state and the disproportionate bequest. Her disinherited grandchildren sued and won. Courts ruled that Helmsley's choices, while eccentric, could not override basic fairness. Helmsley, who once ruled an empire of luxury hotels and estates, died remembered not for her empire, but for a dog who flew private and dined on filet mignon. These legal battles weren't just about money. They were about meaning, about power, and above all, about control. The very thing every one of these stars had spent a lifetime chasing. In courtrooms echoing with testimony, deposition, and quiet outrage, their lives were parsed, picked apart, and redefined. And in the end, they had no say in the final edit. But maybe that's the great irony of legacy. You can script your last words, but you can't control how they're read. Next, we'll reflect on the deeper meaning of these wills. Not just as legal documents, but as emotional artifacts. What do they really say about fame, love, and the yearning to be remembered? Let's bring it all home. Chapter 9. What they really left behind. These weren't just wills. They were confessions disguised as contracts, blueprints for remembrance, control panels wired with grief, regret, and a longing for permanence. They reveal, more than anything, that the golden age of Hollywood was not just a factory of stars, but a crucible of fractured souls. Howard Hughes, the loner billionaire, built planes that touched the edge of the stratosphere but never built a single real human connection that survived to the end. His silence, in life and in his will, said more than any grand pronouncement could have. What he left behind was a riddle, a vacuum, and perhaps that was his truest legacy. To be remembered by absence, not presence. Marilyn Monroe left behind contradictions, a will full of affection for those who wounded her, a death that turned her into a martyr. She had once feared being forgotten, but the world refused to let her go. In choosing Strasberg and Dr. Chris as beneficiaries, she wasn't just rewarding loyalty, she was affirming identity. She died yearning to be seen, and her will, curiously, gave that power to those who had either shaped or restrained her. Joan Crawford left behind perfection, not the kind that breathes or forgives, but the kind chiseled in ice. Her will was a final act of control, her last performance. Yet the legacy she tried to preserve was shattered by truth, or at least someone's version of it. In trying to write the end of her story, she instead sparked its most contested chapter. Leona Helmsley left behind fear. Her name became shorthand for cruelty and wealth. Her will was full of precision, but devoid of compassion. She didn't just distribute assets, she issued commands. Yet those commands, no matter how expensive, were overturned. And in that reversal, her real story emerged. Money can build palaces, but it can't build love. Together, these stars illuminate the paradox of fame. They were worshipped by millions but trusted almost no one. They had everything, yet often died in loneliness or confusion. And their wills, those carefully typed, notarized documents, were not shields against chaos. They were windows into the very chaos they could no longer hide. In the end, what they left behind was not just property or money or drama. They left behind proof that even the brightest stars carry shadows, that the final word doesn't always bring closure. Sometimes it just opens a new mystery. Now, as the lights dim and the reel flickers to its last frame, we arrive at the epilogue, the quiet coda, the poetic end to this strange procession of wills and wants. Let's take one last moment to reflect, not just on how these stars died, but on what they truly left behind. Chapter 10. The Will to be Remembered. Somewhere in a forgotten drawer in Beverly Hills, an envelope lies untouched, yellowed at the corners, sealed with a wax stamp, a name scrawled in fading ink. It might be meaningless. It might be worth millions. That's how it is with wills. They are time bombs. Diaries disguised as directives, final messages written in the hush between heartbeats. And for the stars of the Golden Age, so carefully sculpted, so obsessively preserved, their wills were the last space where no director yelled, "Cut," where no publicist interfered, where the truth, or some version of it, bled through. In death, they did not become simpler. They became stranger. Howard Hughes disappeared into silence, but left behind a name that still echoes through courtrooms. Marilyn Monroe reached out to the very people who had held the keys to her sanity, and perhaps to her undoing. Joan Crawford swung a final axe of disinheritance, only to be remembered for the family she tried to erase. And Leona Helmsley gave her love to a dog because the humans around her had long since stopped deserving it. These weren't just strange decisions. They were the aftershocks of lives lived in glass houses under Klieg lights, burdened by image and haunted by loneliness. We read their wills today not for gossip, but for understanding, because in the oddest bequests, in the coldest omissions, in the extravagant absurdities, we find clues to who they really were when no one was looking. Maybe they weren't trying to be remembered. Maybe they were just trying to be understood. And now, with their secrets unlocked, their safes emptied, and their voices reduced to court transcripts and hearsay, we are left with something far more valuable than money. We are left with the story, a story that even in its strangest moments makes them human again. And perhaps that is the strangest legacy of all. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment down below as it helps support this channel. Also, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to get notified of our newest videos. Thanks for watching.